The young man had spent 7 years studying aikido in Japan and had come back to Los Angeles carrying something he had decided was definitive, and the man he had just grabbed by the wrist had spent 20 years building something he was about to demonstrate could not be held. That was what the people in the front rows would realize, but not yet. Not yet. Right now, at this specific second, what the 3,000 people in the Long Beach arena were looking at was a 22-year-old who was 6 feet tall and trained and certain, holding Bruce Lee's wrist in a grip that he was using the full leverage of 7 years to maintain, and Bruce Lee looking at the grip with the expression of a man reading a sentence that has a small but important error in it. The man in the front row, the heavyweight boxing champion, who had been watching martial arts events for years and who almost never came out of his seat for anything, came out of his seat. He did not stand because something bad was about to happen. He stood because he could feel, from 20 feet away, that something was about to happen that he had never seen before and that he did not want to miss. He was correct about all of that. To understand what was about to happen, you have to go back about an hour, which is how far back the evening goes before the moment that mattered. The Long Beach International Karate Championships in the early 1970s was the kind of event that the martial arts world in America ran on, a gathering that brought serious practitioners from multiple disciplines into the same building for a weekend of competition and demonstration, where the line between what was performed and what was tested blurred in ways that the organizers could not always predict and did not always want to. 3,000 people had filled the arena, not the casual crowd that fills an arena for entertainment, the specific crowd of martial arts events in that period, practitioners and coaches and serious fans who knew enough to know what they were looking at, and who came because they wanted to see the real thing rather than a version of it shaped for people who didn't know the difference. Muhammad Ali was in the front row. He had come the way famous people come to events in other sports, as a guest and as a genuine fan of what the discipline produced, and he had been watching for 2 hours with the specific alert stillness of a man who studies physical capability for a living and recognizes it when he sees it. He had said almost nothing. He sat with his arms folded and his chin slightly down and his eyes tracking everything on the floor with the same focus he brought to watching tape of fighters he was about to fight. He had come out of his seat twice during the evening, both times briefly, both times for a specific moment that other people in the room had not fully processed yet. The third time he came out of his seat was the time that mattered. Bruce Lee had demonstrated earlier in the program. 40 minutes before the moment with the wrist, he had stood on the floor in front of 3,000 people and done the things he did in front of crowds, the 1-inch punch, speed demonstrations, some technical explanations of what Jeet Kune Do was trying to do, and why the doing of it required a different understanding of force than most people brought to the question. The crowd had responded the way crowds responded to Bruce at this point in his career, with the specific enthusiasm of people who had seen Enter the Dragon and were watching something they knew was connected to that and were trying to figure out how. Ali, in the front row, had watched it with his chin down and his arms folded and had not stood up. Steven Seagal, from his position in the practitioners area to the right of the demonstration floor, had watched it with his arms folded and had not stood up either. But the quality of their watching was different. Ali was watching to understand something. Seagal was watching to find a problem. He was 22 years old. He had been training in aikido since he was 15, had spent significant time in Japan, studying under serious teachers, had come back to America with a technical foundation that the people who had watched him work described as genuinely extraordinary for someone his age. He could do things with leverage and redirection that made people who knew what they were looking at stop and pay attention. He was also, at 22, in a specific state of confidence that comes from having built something real over 7 years and having found nothing that had tested it adequately. The confidence was based on evidence. That was what made it a problem. Evidence that hasn't yet encountered its edge looks like complete understanding. He had been watching Bruce's demonstration with the specific attention of someone building a case, not to be fair to the case, to win it. He had been constructing a critique, the way a careful thinker constructs a critique, finding the places where the evidence didn't fully support the claim. The critique he had been building was this: what Bruce was demonstrating was beautiful and impressive and technically sophisticated, but it was being demonstrated in the cooperative context that all demonstrations exist in, where the person on the receiving end of the technique understood that they were supposed to respond to the technique in the way the technique was designed to produce. Seagal knew this because he knew demonstrations, and because he had done thousands of them, and because he understood, with the specific understanding of someone who had been on both sides, that there was a gap between what a technique did to a cooperative partner and what it did to someone who was actually trying to not let it work. He believed the gap in Bruce's demonstrations was larger than Bruce was representing. He was wrong about that, but he hadn't found out yet. When the demonstrations ended and the organizer was preparing to transition to the evening's competitive segment, Seagal walked onto the floor. He did not ask for the microphone. He did not announce himself. He walked out with the specific purposeful direction of a man who has decided something and is executing the decision, and the crowd read the purpose in the walk and went quiet, the way crowds go quiet when they understand that something unplanned is happening. He walked toward Bruce. Bruce watched him come. Seagal said, "I want to ask you something." Bruce said, "Ask it." Seagal said, "What you demonstrated tonight was against cooperative resistance. Your partners knew what you were going to do and knew how to respond to it. That's not the same as someone who's actually trying to stop it." He said it directly and without hostility, the statement of someone who had thought about something carefully and was saying what the thinking had produced. Bruce said, "You're right." Seagal looked slightly surprised by the agreement. Bruce said, "A demonstration with a cooperative partner is not the same as a fully resistant opponent. Every serious practitioner knows that distinction." Seagal said, "So what would it look like against someone who was actually resisting?" Bruce said, "It would look different in the specifics and the same in the principles." Seagal said, "I'd like to see the principles tested." He said it the way someone says something when they have been working up to it for 40 minutes and have arrived. Bruce said, "What do you have in mind?" Seagal said, "Aikido wrist control, against someone who knows what you're going to do and is going to use everything they have to prevent it." He said, "Me." The floor was very quiet. If you think that was the most pointed moment of what Seagal said in front of 3,000 people, what he did 40 seconds later will show you that he wasn't finished. Bruce said, "All right." Seagal stepped in. He moved the way Aikido practitioners move when they are initiating a control technique, with the specific commitment of someone who has done this movement 10,000 times and whose body knows it as well as breathing. He reached for Bruce's right wrist with both hands, the double wrist grip that Aikido uses to establish leverage and control, and from which a range of throws and pins can be applied. Real grip, full commitment. The grip of someone who had spent 7 years specifically learning how to make this grip hold against resistance. He got hold of the wrist, he tightened the grip, he set his leverage, and then he applied what he had. What he had was real. The technique was real, and the strength behind it was real, and the 7 years behind the technique were real, and for about 3 seconds he held Bruce Lee's wrist in a grip that he was using everything he knew to maintain, and that he genuinely believed he could maintain. Bruce did not pull against it. He did not struggle or twist or try to break the grip in any of the ways that people try to break grips when grips are applied to them. He stood with his wrist in Seagal's grip and looked at the grip with the expression I described at the beginning, the expression of a man reading a sentence with a small, important error in it. He said something that the front rows heard clearly and that traveled through the audience in pieces, the words moving outward through the crowd in the specific wave that information moves through a crowd when it comes from the center of something everyone is watching. He said, "You have my wrist." He paused. He said, "You don't have my arm." And then he moved. Not away from the grip, into it. His body turned slightly, not dramatically, the specific small rotation that generates the specific leverage that makes a specific thing possible. And what happened to Seagal's grip in the next fraction of a second was what the people in the front rows would spend years trying to describe, and generally failing at. The grip did not break. It did not come loose. It opened. The distinction is important. Breaking implies force applied against force. Coming loose implies failure of hold. What happened was neither of those. Seagal's hands opened in the specific way of hands that have received a signal through the wrists and arms that holding is not currently available as an option, and the opening was not a choice he made. It was what happened when the leverage Bruce had found inside the grip made holding and releasing the same thing. Seagal stood there with his hands open. He looked at them. He looked at Bruce. In the front row, Ali came out of his seat. He did not stand dramatically. He rose the way a man rises when he has been watching something and has arrived at a point where sitting down is no longer compatible with attending fully to what's happening. He was on his feet, and his arms were at his sides, and his eyes were on the floor, specifically on Bruce's hands, and Seagal's hands, and the space between them. The crowd had produced the specific sound of a crowd that has watched something happen that exceeds the frame it came prepared with. Seagal said, "Do that again." He said it immediately. Not with anger, with the specific urgency of a man who has felt something happen that his training did not account for, and who needs to understand what happened before he loses the immediacy of the experience. Bruce said, "Which part?" Seagal said, "The grip opened." Bruce said, "Yes." Seagal said, I didn't open it. Bruce said, I know. Seagal said, how? Bruce said, I'll show you. He stepped toward Seagal again. This time he reached for Seagal's wrist instead, demonstrating the reverse, and Seagal felt where the fingers were placed, and felt the specific angle of the contact, and felt what happened when Bruce made the small movement that made the leverage, that made the grip incompatible with holding. Seagal's own wrist opened, his fingers spread. He stood looking at his own open hand. He said, the angle. Bruce said, the angle and the timing. The angle finds the joint position where grip and release are the same movement. The timing is when the leverage is applied, which is after the grip is fully committed, rather than before. Seagal said, if you apply it before I fully commit. Bruce said, you'd feel it coming and adjust. After you're fully committed, the adjustment isn't available. Seagal said, because the commitment has already gone to physics. Bruce said, yes. He said, once you've fully committed, the force belongs to physics rather than to you. If I can find the geometry that the physics is committed to, I can redirect the physics without meeting the force. Seagal was quiet. He said, I spent 7 years in Japan, learning to do that to other people. Bruce said, yes. He said, and you just did it to me. Bruce said, in a specific situation with a specific technique. One application. Seagal said, against 7 years of training. Bruce said, 7 years of training in how to apply it, not in how to receive it from someone who understands what you're doing. He said, the two are different things. You've spent 7 years learning one half of the conversation. What you just experienced was the other half. Seagal was very still. Then he did something that told you something specific and important about who he was, underneath the 22 years, and the 7 years, and the confidence that had walked him out onto that floor. He said, show me the rest of it. He said it directly, and without performance. Bruce said, the rest of what? He said, the other half. Whatever I haven't spent 7 years learning. He said, I came out here because I believed there was a gap between what you demonstrated and what would happen against real resistance, and I used my best technique with full commitment, and I'm standing here with my hand open. So the gap is somewhere else from where I thought it was. He said, show me where it actually is. Bruce looked at him for a moment. He said, you're sure? Seagal said, I drove out here from Santa Monica to a martial arts championship to find the honest thing. I want to find it. Bruce said, all right. What happened in the next 20 minutes on that floor in front of 3,000 people in the Long Beach arena was not a demonstration in the way demonstrations usually work, where one person knows what they're doing and the other person is cooperating with a predetermined outcome. It was a conversation in a physical language. Bruce worked with Seagal through 4 more exchanges. Different techniques, different angles. Seagal bringing everything he had each time, not performing resistance, but actually resisting, and Bruce working through and around and inside it, each time, in ways that were different from the previous time, so that Seagal could not anticipate the specific geometry and could only try to understand the principle. After the 4th exchange, Seagal sat down on the floor where he was standing, not because he was forced to, because sitting was the appropriate response to something he was in the middle of processing. He sat there for about 30 seconds. The crowd had been following this for 20 minutes and was now in the specific quiet of 3,000 people who have watched something that exceeded their expectation of what was possible and are trying to work out what they've seen. Ali, still standing in the front row, had his arms folded and his chin down and his eyes on Seagal sitting on the floor. Seagal said, from the floor, to Bruce, standing above him, how long have you been doing this? Bruce said, 20 years. Seagal said, I have 7. Bruce said, yes. Seagal said, and in 7 years I have never felt that happen. Bruce said, what did it feel like? Seagal said, like the thing I was applying became the thing being applied to me. Like the resistance was using my own technique. Bruce said, yes. Seagal said, how do you learn to do that? Bruce said, you start by understanding what technique is trying to do, not the movement, the intention behind the movement, what force is trying to accomplish. He said, once you understand what a technique is trying to accomplish, you understand what it requires, and what it requires is always where it's vulnerable. Because requirement is commitment, and commitment has a geometry, and geometry can be found. Seagal said, that's 20 years of understanding. Bruce said, that's every day of 20 years, yes. He said, you have 7 years, which means you have a foundation that most people don't have and a significant distance still to go. Seagal said, is there a Tuesday equivalent, somewhere you send people? Bruce almost smiled. He said, Culver City, Come on a morning when you don't have anywhere to be. Seagal said, What morning? Bruce said, Any morning. In the front row, Ali sat back down. He sat back down the way he had stood up, without drama, the movement of someone who has watched something and is now done watching the specific thing and is filing the specific thing in the specific place. He said something to the man sitting next to him, quiet, just to the man next to him. The man next to him later said that what Ali said was, That's the one thing you can't get bigger than. He said it looking at the floor, at where Bruce and Seagal were talking, at the space between them. The tournament organizer had been standing at the side of the floor for 20 minutes, not knowing whether to intervene, and had concluded that the right decision was to let the thing complete itself. He came out now and said something into the microphone about thanking both participants for an extraordinary demonstration, and the crowd responded with the applause that had been building for 20 minutes, and was finally finding a place to go. Seagal stood up from the floor. He was on his feet with the specific quality of someone who has been somewhere interior and is returning to the external room. He looked at Bruce. He said, I came out here to find a problem with your demonstration. Bruce said, I know. Seagal said, I found a different problem from the one I was looking for. Bruce said, Yes. Seagal said, The problem I found is that there are 7 years of something I don't know. He said, That's not the problem I came here to find. Bruce said, No. Seagal said, It's the more useful one. Bruce said, Yes. He said, The problem you came here to find was whether my demonstrations represented real capability. Finding that problem and answering it would have told you something about me, he said. The problem you found instead tells you something about you. That's worth more. Seagal looked at him. He said, I grabbed your wrist. Bruce said, Yes. He said, In front of 3,000 people. Bruce said, Yes. He said, To prove the gap I was looking for. Bruce said, Yes, he said, and the gap was on my side, not yours. Bruce said, The gap was in your understanding of what your 7 years covers, not in your 7 years. He said, Your 7 years is real. The question it hadn't answered yet is where it ends. He said, Now you know where it ends. Most people don't get that until much later. He said, You're 22. You have time to work with the information. Seagal was quiet for a moment. He said, I owe you something. Bruce said, You don't owe me anything. He said, I walked onto this floor, and I grabbed your wrist without your consent to make a point in front of 3,000 people. Bruce said, You wanted to test something honestly. Seagal said, I wanted to be right in public. He said it simply. The honest version of the thing. Bruce said, Yes. He said, The honest testing and the wanting to be right in public are sometimes the same thing and sometimes different things. Tonight they started as the same thing and became different things. Seagal said, What changed them? Bruce said, You sat down on the floor. He said, When you sat down on the floor and stayed there, you stopped wanting to be right in public. You started wanting to understand what happened. That's where they became different things. Seagal was very still. Bruce reached out and put his hand on Seagal's shoulder. He said, Come to Culver City, any morning. He said it the way you say something you mean, when you don't need the other person to confirm that you mean it. He walked off the floor. He walked past the front row, and he looked at Ali, and Ali looked at him, and they held the look for about 2 seconds, the specific 2 seconds of two serious people, acknowledging each other across the small distance of a shared understanding. Ali nodded once, the small complete nod of someone saying yes to something that was said without words. Bruce nodded back. Same quality. He walked past the front row and through the side exit and was gone before most of the crowd had finished its applause. Seagal stood on the floor for another moment. The organizer came and said something to him. He nodded. He walked back to the practitioner's area. He sat down. He did not talk to the people around him. He sat with the specific interior quality of someone who has received something and is in the early process of understanding what to do with it. The tournament continued. The evening's competitive segment ran for another 2 hours and was excellent, and was not what anyone in the building was going to be talking about the following morning. I drove home after midnight. I had been at martial arts events for 12 years, and I had watched a great many things in those years, many of them genuinely extraordinary. What I kept thinking about on the drive home was not the grip opening, not the 4 exchanges, not Ali standing up. What I kept thinking about was Seagal sitting down on the floor. He had walked out in front of 3,000 people with 7 years of real training and a real point to make, and the specific confidence of someone who had built something and believed in what they had built. And he had grabbed a man's wrist and found the other half of the conversation, and it had opened his hands without asking his permission, and he had sat down on the floor. Not because he was hurt, not because he was forced to, because sitting down was the honest physical response to the information he had just received. Because the floor was where you go when something you were standing on turns out to be smaller than you thought. And because he sat down, he got back up with something he didn't have when he walked out. I am 74 years old. I have thought about that floor for 50 years. About the grip opening, and about the sitting down, and about the thing Ali said to the man next to him that I heard secondhand the following week from someone who had been sitting close enough to the front row to hear it. That's the one thing you can't get bigger than. Said by the most famous fighter in the world about a man sitting on a floor in Long Beach who had just found out where 7 years ended. Bruce Lee died the following year. He was 32 years old. The Tuesday in Culver City never happened. The any morning never happened. Whatever the next 7 years would have built in Steven Seagal, it did not build in that specific room with that specific teacher. But the floor in Long Beach happened, the sitting down happened, the getting up with something new happened, and that's not nothing. That's not nothing at all. I was there. This is the whole story.